So, here to do that with me is the former Home Office Minister, Norman Baker. Thank you very, very much, Norman. Great to have you on the show. There he is. So, what does happen, in theory, if somebody comes over on a short-term visa and overstays?
Well, a happy bank holiday to you, Patrick, as well. Look, when we were in government in the coalition, the Lib Dems insisted that we introduced exit checks, and that was to find out who was actually leaving the country, because unless you have exit checks, you don't know when people have left. I hope they're still in place. It was also a way of keeping a track on how many people were not leaving, and that's important because if they want to apply again at some future date to come to the UK, you can identify that they have overstayed. So the exit checks are actually quite important. But in terms of who's not leaving, the vast majority of people who come here legally on short-term visa do leave. The seasonal workers, the students and so on, they've got jobs to go to when they get back. So it's a minority who don't leave, but the exit checks enable you to pick up those who haven't returned to their own countries as they should have done. But in terms of picking those up and identifying those, that's one thing. The second thing is enforcing their removal. And as you said, it's pretty terrible. Only 1% of people who applied for asylum have been processed. And that equally applies to those who are overstayed and the Home Office isn't chasing up, because there is insufficient enforcement, in my view, both of overstayers and indeed processing to get refugee claims properly assessed.
But a lot of these people who come over for seasonal work are of marginal economic benefit to this country as it is. They are not the doctors and whoever else that people like to dine out on when they say, look how great it is that our immigration figures are so vast, OK? So these are not those people. And then when they overstay, they contribute absolutely nothing. And the sad fact, unfortunately, is we don't know how many people overstay, do we?
Well, we ought to know because of the exit checks in place, but I don't know whether they're still there or whether the government's abandoned those. I think the farming community and the fishing community would argue that the seasonal workers are very important. Indeed, the government's visa system shouldn't allow people in with a visa if they're not required for seasonal work, which is necessary. And of course, we don't have enough British people picking fruit and so on, so that's why the visas are issued in the first place.
Can I ask, just Norman, on that, sorry to interrupt, but that's a really important point that you make there, because in practice, in theory, I'm inclined to agree with you. But then I go and see and visit a fruit-picking hub and a food processing hub, and I see people walking around who cannot speak a word of English and are not... They clearly don't have a penny to their name, OK? And it's actually, in many cases, quite sad to see. But that is the reality of it. And I do not see how those people were ever given a visa. I mean, we will just give it to anyone, won't we?
Well, I mean, I think there's a quota set by the government, for example, for agricultural workers, and then people apply to fill the quota. And I suppose, to be brutal about it, you don't need to speak English to pick raspberries. So maybe that's the case. You know, the system is not working properly, Patrick. No doubt about that. One thing I've always believed in, which is I'm not sure it's a minority of you or not, is that people who are here seeking refugee status, that's different from those who are here on visas. But those who are seeking refugee status ought to be able to work when they're here. They ought to be able to contribute to society. That would give them some self-respect and relieve the taxpayer of a big burden.
Well, you could argue that, but again, what you would have to believe there is that people were here genuinely as refugees and not as the group of economic migrants who could have applied legally, and the only reason that they're not applying legally is because they would be deemed to be of economic insignificance to us, and so they come here illegally. But you would let them work, would you?
Well, I can only quote to the figures, which are the vast majority of people who have their asylum claims assessed are actually allowed to stay because the asylum claims are validated. Now, the people I'm talking about, people coming from war-torn areas like Syria and so on, who clearly were in danger of their torture or their lives being lost. There was an issue with Albania, which I was quite hard on, to say we shouldn't be allowing Albanians in because they, by and large, were economic migrants. And it appears the government, by negotiating with the Albanian government, which I argued for some time ago, has actually potentially shut that particular avenue off. But most people who apply for asylum actually are deemed to be genuine applicants.
Okay. Just to say, Norman, just to return us back to the issue of the overstayers, okay? There should be, clearly, more checks. But when you see these net migration figures dropping, as in them landing, I should say, of course the figures have actually gone up themselves, they're not true, are they? Because we look around and we do not know how many people have overstayed by definition, and we are not massively checking. I mean, there were 2 police officers in a town square behind me dealing with a couple of very drunken Bulgarians who, dare I say it, they've been Home Office officials, could have checked to see whether or not they actually have the official documentation to stay in the country and solved a problem. But it's not happening, is it? I mean, and we talk about overcrowding in houses and issues with public services and all of this. I mean, if we did clamp down on people and had a more efficient system for knocking on people's doors and finding out who lives in that house and whether or not they've overstayed, then actually we might have a bit more room.
Well, as I say, we ought to know who's overstaying, because unless the government's abolished the exit checks that Lib Dems brought in government, they ought to know that figure. They ought to be able to identify who has left the country, tick them off, as you like, and then, therefore, by definition, who hasn't left the country. That was the point of the exit checks. So they ought to be able to give you that figure if you ask for it. But in terms of enforcement, no, I don't think they are enforcing it properly, and they ought to be more rigorous than that. I want to be very fair to people who come here seeking asylum and are genuine refugees. I want to be unfair, if you like, on people who aren't here with proper good reason, and they should be processed and deported quickly.